The morning the Yaks came was a Tuesday in the third week of April, 1998. I remember the fog was low and thick, the color of old tin, clinging to the hollows in the fields so you couldn't see the fence posts 100 yards out. It was that kind of damp chill that gets in your bones, the kind that makes you think about the cost of propane and the state of the caulking around the window frames. The air smelled of wet earth waking up. The cattle truck groaned up the gravel lane just after 6, its headlights cutting two soft, yellow cones in the grayness. It wasn't a big semi, just a heavy-duty 1-ton with a 24-foot stock trailer, and the driver, a young man I didn't know, looked cold and tired. He handed me the bill of lading on a clipboard, the paper already growing soft in the damp air. 22 head, it said. Destination, my farm. He didn't ask what they were, he just wanted to get them off his truck. I signed the line and pointed him toward the holding pen by the barn. The ramp came down with a hollow clang that echoed in the quiet morning, and they began to file out, slow and deliberate. They weren't cattle. They were shaggy, low-slung, with horns that swept out and up like ancient scythes. Their coats were a mix of black and dark brown, thick and deep, and they moved with a quiet dignity that made the pen seem smaller. They didn't bellow or rush. They just walked out, their breath pluming in the cold air, their dark eyes taking everything in without alarm. 22 yaks on a farm that had only ever known Angus and Hereford for 3 generations. The driver watched the last one step off, a big bull with a sweep of hair over his eyes. He latched the gate and looked at me, then at the yaks, then back at me. He didn't say a word, just gave a little nod, took his copy of the paperwork, and climbed back into his warm cab. As he drove away, the sound of his engine fading back into the fog, I stood there watching them. They were already testing the hay in the feeder, not greedily, but with a kind of thoughtful consideration. The money for them had been set aside for something else, something sensible. The cab on my tractor, a 1982 International, had seen better decades. The glass on the left door had a spiderweb crack from a thrown rock 10 years ago, and a piece of clear plastic from a feed bag had been taped over the hole for the last 3 winters. The seals were gone, so in the cold, a steady draft worked its way in, and in the rain, a little rivulet of water would run down the inside of the dash. In the summer, the air conditioning was just a memory you'd try to conjure up while the sun beat down on the metal roof. A new cab installed was going to be $4,850. The yaks, the whole lot of them delivered from a fellow out west who was getting out of the business, had cost me $4,500. I'd spent the tractor money on 22 hairy beasts that my part of the country had never seen outside of a zoo. By noon, the diner in town had a version of the story, and the version had grown. The kid who drove the truck must have stopped in for coffee. By the time I went in for a part at the supply co-op, the story was that I'd bought a herd of buffalo and was planning to tear out all my fences. I could feel the gentle mockery in the air, the way men who have known you your whole life will look at you when they think you've finally taken a step off the path of good sense. It wasn't unkind, not really. It was just the way of things in a small town. You do something different, you become the story for a week. I knew what they were thinking, that I was getting old, getting sentimental, trading a practical piece of equipment for a pasture full of curiosities. And on the surface, they were right. Every time I'd climb into that cold, drafty tractor cab for the next year, I'd be reminded of my choice. But I didn't do it for sentiment. I did it because of the upper 80 acres of high, scrubby rangeland at the back of the property that my father had always called marginal and my grandfather had simply called the high pasture. It was rocky, the soil was thin, and the water was unreliable. We ran a few head of cattle up there in the spring when the grass was green, but by mid-July it was baked hard and the stock tank, fed by a half-hearted seasonal creek, was usually bone dry. It was problem ground. But I had a reason to believe there was something up there the cattle had always missed, something the experts with their soil charts and their water tables had never accounted for. I didn't know for sure. It was a hunch, built on a memory and a line of faded pencil in an old notebook. I didn't know yet what the yaks knew, only that they were an old breed, from a place of high, thin ground. They were built to pay attention, to survive on less, to read the land in a language my cattle had long forgotten. And I was betting $4,000 $500 that they could read a story on that upper 80 that no one else had been able to decipher for the last 100 years. Standing there in the fog, watching them, I felt the weight of that bet. It was a quiet, heavy thing. The first test of that bet came 2 days later. My neighbor, who farms the quarter section to my west, pulled his truck up to the fence line. It was a new truck, always clean, the kind of truck a man buys when he's had a few good years and wants the world to know it. He's a good man, a good farmer, but he believes in what's new. New seed, new equipment, new chemicals. He thinks the old ways are mostly just old ways of going broke slowly. He rolled down his power window and leaned an elbow on the door, the engine humming quietly. He nodded at the yaks in the holding pen. "Morning," he said. I nodded back. "Morning." He watched them for a long moment. They watched him back with that same unnerving calm. "Those are the things I heard about at the co-op," he said. It wasn't a question. "They are," I said. He chewed on that for a second. "What are you doing with 22 yaks on 400 acres of corn and bean ground?" The unspoken part of the question was, instead of buying a cab for that rattling old tractor of yours, I knew the question was fair. I told him I was farming. He smiled a little at that, a polite smile that didn't reach his eyes. "What's the market for yak meat around here?" "Don't know," I said. "Haven't tried to sell any fiber?" he asked, gesturing at their thick coats. "There's a niche market," I said. "Takes a lot of processing." He shook his head slowly, still smiling that thin smile. "Well, it's your money." He looked past the barn, up the long slope toward the high pasture. "You're not thinking of putting them up on that top 80, are you? There's nothing up there for them by August. And no water to speak of." "That's the plan," I said. He just looked at me. The smile was gone now, replaced by a look of genuine, neighborly concern. The kind of look that says you're making a mistake he's going to have to hear about all winter. He didn't argue. He just said, "Well, you know your own ground," which was his way of saying the exact opposite. He put the truck in gear and drove on down the fence line, leaving me there with the quiet judgment hanging in the air. The next visitor was more official. The county extension agent, a young man named Peterson, stopped by the following week. He was earnest, well-meaning, and armed with a clipboard and a 3-ring binder full of data. He'd heard about the yaks and wanted to run the numbers with me. We stood by the pen and he looked them over with a professional eye. "Exotic livestock," he said, making a note. "Interesting choice." He started asking questions. "Daily water consumption, forage preference, rate of gain." I answered what I could. Then he got to the point. "Your neighbor mentioned you were planning to pasture these on your upper 80 acres. "That's right," I said. He flipped a few pages in his binder. He had aerial maps of my property, soil type charts overlaid in different colors. "Okay," he said, tapping a pale yellow section of the map with his pen. "According to our soil surveys, that parcel is mostly thin loam over fractured shale. The carrying capacity for standard beef cattle is rated at 1 animal unit per 20 acres, and that's only for about 90 days in the spring." He looked up at me over the top of his glasses. "The limiting factor, as I'm sure you know, is water. The intermittent stream up there is unreliable, and we show no records of any wells or developed springs on that parcel. Frankly, it's not economical to run water lines that far for what little forage you get." He was just stating facts. He wasn't being unkind. He was trying to help me avoid a costly mistake. "These animals," he said, gesturing to the yaks, "are browsers as much as grazers. They might do a bit better on the scrub up there than cattle would. But their water requirement is still going to be substantial. You put 22 head up there, and that stock tank will be a mud hole in a week. By July, you'll be hauling water up a 2-mile track twice a day. The fuel and time alone will eat you alive." He closed his binder with a soft snap. The sound of settled science, of data-driven certainty. "I'm just advising you to reconsider the stocking plan," he said. "Maybe keep them down here on the better pasture and supplement with hay." I thanked him for his time. I told him I appreciated the advice. I didn't tell him what my grandfather had said about that ground. I didn't tell him about the notebook. Not yet. I didn't know myself what the yaks knew, only that they were built to pay attention to things a man in a hurry, Even a man with a clipboard full of charts would miss. The world is full of people who can tell you what the numbers say. They can tell you what's likely, what's practical, what's efficient. They mean well. But the numbers are based on what's already been measured. They don't always account for what's been forgotten. And that upper 80, I was starting to believe, was holding a secret that had been forgotten for a very long time. My real reason for buying those Yaks went back nearly 50 years, to a hot afternoon in late August. I must have been about 10 years old. My grandfather had taken me up to the high pasture to check on a few stray heifers that hadn't come down with the rest of the herd. We'd walked the fence line, the sun beating down on us, the air thick with the smell of dry grass and hot dust. The ground was cracked and hard as pavement. The creek bed was just a ribbon of pale, sun-bleached stones. We found the heifers huddled under the shade of the only decent stand of oaks on the whole 80 acres, their heads low, their sides heaving. The stock tank was nothing but cracked mud. My grandfather, who was a man of few words, just stood there for a long time, looking not at the cattle, but at the land itself. He wasn't looking at it with the disappointment of a farmer looking at a failed pasture. He was looking at it with a kind of deep curiosity, as if he were reading a book written in a language only he understood. He pointed with his chin toward a low, granite ridge that ran along the north side of the pasture. "Look there," he said. I looked. It was just a spine of rock and a tangle of scrub brush and sumac. "See how the green holds on a little longer at the base of that rock?" I looked closer, and he was right. While the rest of the pasture was bleached yellow and brown, there was a patch of darker green, some stubborn weeds and deeper-rooted grasses, clinging to the ground right where the slope met the rock face. It wasn't lush, but it was alive. "Thirsty ground always remembers where the water was," he said, more to himself than to me. "You just got to find something that speaks its language." We spent the rest of the afternoon rounding up the heifers and driving them down to the lower fields where the well-fed tanks were full. But that image and his words, they stayed with me. My grandfather was not a sentimental man. He was practical down to his bones. He farmed through the Depression and the droughts that followed. He understood profit and loss as well as any man. But he also believed the land had its own memory, its own logic that predated deeds and property lines and soil charts. He believed that animals, especially the old breeds that hadn't had the instinct bred out of them, were closer to that logic. They could read the subtle signs, the change in vegetation, the coolness of the soil, the presence of certain insects, that we had forgotten how to see. He never did anything with that upper 80. He didn't have the capital to drill a well on a hunch, and he had better ground that demanded his attention. He and my father just accepted it for what it was, marginal pasture, a place to get a little spring grazing and not much else. But he would still walk it sometimes. I'd see him up there in the evenings, not doing anything, just walking slow, his head down, reading the ground. When he passed, he left me the farm. And my father, who was more like my neighbor, more of a modern farmer, continued to treat the upper 80 as an afterthought. It was the land of last resort. For years, I did the same. I had bills to pay, machinery to maintain, a family to raise. I farmed the way my father had, focusing on the productive acres, the ones that paid the bills. But the memory of that afternoon with my grandfather never quite faded. His words would come back to me at odd times, usually when I was looking at that high ground, feeling that old, familiar sense of a problem without a solution. Then, a few years ago, I started reading about these yaks. I read that they were adapted to high altitudes, to thin air and marginal forage. I read that they could browse on shrubs and woody plants that cattle wouldn't touch. And I read that they had an uncanny instinct for finding water, that in their native lands, the herds would travel for miles to find hidden seeps and springs that were invisible to the human eye. Something clicked. An idea began to form, an idea so impractical that I didn't mention it to anyone, not even my wife. It was the kind of idea that sounds foolish when you say it out loud. What if my grandfather was right? What if there was water up there, not deep down where a driller would look, but somewhere shallow, hidden, a secret the land was keeping? What if the problem wasn't the land, but the animals we were putting on it? What if the Angus and the Hereford, bred for generations to thrive on lush pasture and corn, had simply forgotten the language the land was speaking? The idea became a quiet obsession. It felt like a debt I owed to my grandfather, a question he had asked that had never been answered. So when the opportunity came to buy that small herd from the man out west, I took it. I spent the tractor money. It was an act of faith, I suppose. Faith in a memory. Faith in an old man's quiet wisdom. And faith in 22 shaggy, primitive beasts who knew nothing of my farm but everything about survival. I knew, even as I did it, that it was a gamble. I knew how it looked. But every time I felt the cold draft from that cracked tractor window, I told myself that some things are more important than comfort. Answering a 50-year-old question was one of them. About a month after the Yaks arrived, I finally worked up the nerve to look for it. The notebook. I knew it existed. My grandfather was a meticulous record-keeper in his own way. Not in ledgers or journals, but in the free calendars and notebooks he got from the seed company every year. He'd write down planting dates, rainfall totals, calving records, machinery repairs, all in a careful, blocky script with a pencil he kept sharpened with a pocket knife. After he died, my father boxed up most of his things and stored them in the old seed cabinet in the workshop. It's a big metal cabinet painted gray that has stood in the same spot for 70 years. I hadn't opened the box labeled Granddad's papers in at least 30 of them. The workshop was quiet that evening, smelling of old oil and dust and time. The only light came from a single bare bulb hanging from a cord over the workbench. I pulled the cardboard box out from behind a stack of old tires and set it on the bench. The tape was dry and brittle, and it came off with a dusty sigh. Inside were stacks of those old notebooks. DeKalb, Pioneer, Funk's G Hybrid. Their covers were faded, the corners soft and rounded from writing in the glove box of his pickup. I pulled one out. It was a DeKalb notebook from 1962. The cover had a picture of a perfect ear of corn on it. I sat down on an old milking stool and started to page through it. The entries were short, terse. A farmer's diary written in the language of work. April 12th. Planted 40 acres of the south field. Soil is cold May 3rd. Then, 2 inches. A good soaker June 1st. Fixed flat on the cultivator. Again I went through half a dozen notebooks, a tour of my family's history told in bushels per acre and the price of diesel. I found the record of the year my father took over most of the planting, the year a hailstorm wiped out half the bean crop, the year they finally bought a self-propelled combine. And then, in a notebook from 1967, I found the page I was looking for. At the top, in my grandfather's hand, it said North Pasture. That's what he always called the upper 80. The page was filled with his usual observations. Notes on the grass quality in the spring. Account of the cattle he'd run up there. A note about fixing the fence on the west side. I read down the page, my heart starting to beat a little faster. I was afraid I had imagined it, that the memory was just a story I told myself. And then I saw it at the very bottom of the page, the last entry for that year. It was written in the same steady pencil script, but it was different from the others. It wasn't a record of work done. It was a question. It said, Bedrock Ridge holds damp. July 67. Ground feels different there, and then, right after it, 2 words that made the hair on my arms stand up. Stone below. He had circled the entry. Just a faint, looping pencil circle. And beside it, he had written one more thing. Never dug. I sat there on that stool for a long time, just staring at the page. Stone below? What had he meant by that? A layer of rock that held the water? Or something else? Something man-made? The words never dug were a kind of testament. A confession of a mystery he had noticed but never had the time or the means to solve. It was a message passed down, a piece of unfinished business. This was it. This was the reason I'd spent the tractor money. It wasn't just a vague memory of a hot afternoon. It was this concrete clue, a map of a sort written on a page in a 50-cent notebook. I felt a profound sense of connection to him in that moment, to the quiet, observant man who had walked that ground and paid enough attention to feel a difference in the soil under his feet and wonder what it meant. He had handed me the question. Now it was up to me to find the answer. I closed the notebook carefully, a feeling of reverence settling over me. I put it back in the box, not because I was done with it, but because I wasn't ready to act. It's one thing to have a clue. It's another thing to know what to do with it. The note gave me a place to look, but it didn't give me a plan. I needed more than a hunch and a circled line of pencil. I needed evidence. And the evidence, I hoped, was standing out in the pasture, chewing its cud in the fading light, waiting to get to work. I turned off the single bulb, leaving the workshop in darkness. The first step was done. I had the question in hand. The next step belonged to the Yaks. I had to be patient enough to let them show me the way. It's a hard thing for a farmer to be patient. We're always racing against the weather, against the calendar, against the markets. But I knew this couldn't be rushed. This was a slow burn problem, and it was going to need a slow burn solution. The following Monday, I opened the gate to the upper 80. The Yaks filed through, not with a rush like cattle would, but in an orderly line, the big bull in the lead. They moved up the long, grassy track toward the high pasture, and I followed at a distance on my old four-wheeler. The air was clear and warm, the sky a deep, washed-out blue. From the top of the rise, you could see for miles. You could also see how poor the ground was. The grass was thin, interspersed with thistle and patches of bare, rocky soil. I watched them spread out. For the first few days, they did what I expected. They grazed, they explored the fence lines, they found the stand of oaks for shade in the afternoon. They drank from the stock tank that was fed by the last of the spring runoff. They were quiet, methodical. I'd go up every morning and every evening just to watch them. I took the old DeKalb notebook with me and a soil probe. The probe is a simple tool, just a T-handle welded to a 3-foot steel rod with a pointed tip. You learn a lot from a tool like that. You learn to feel the difference between clay and loam, sand and hardpan, just by the resistance in your hands and shoulders. You can feel where the moisture is, where the rocks are, where the life is in the soil. I started where my grandfather had pointed, at the base of the low granite ridge on the north side of the pasture. I walked a grid just like he would have, pacing off 20 steps and then pushing the probe into the ground. At first, it was just as the extension agent's charts had predicted. 6, maybe 8 inches of dry, crumbly topsoil, and then the probe would stop dead with a metallic scrape on the fractured shale below. I did this for hours, making my way along the base of the ridge. I was starting to feel a familiar sense of disappointment. The ground was exactly as poor as everyone had always said it was. But the Yaks weren't spending their time where I was probing. I noticed they had started to cluster in one particular area, a shallow swale or depression about 200 yards east of where I was working. It wasn't obvious, just a slight dip in the landscape. But they were drawn to it. They'd grazed the whole pasture, but they always ended up back there, lying in the shade of the ridge in the afternoon, even when there was better shade under the oaks. I watched them for a week. They weren't just resting there. I saw the bull pawing at the ground, not aggressively, but just scraping away the topsoil with his hoof, then putting his nose down to it. A few of the cows did the same. It was a deliberate, specific behavior focused on one particular spot. So I abandoned my grid and went to where they were. I walked over to the swale. The vegetation looked the same to me, the same thin grass, the same thistles. I took out the probe and pushed it into the ground right where the bull had been pawing. It was different. The probe sank easily, smoothly. I pushed it deeper. 1 foot, 2 feet. It didn't stop. I put my weight into it, and the rod slid down to the hilt, a full 3 feet into the earth without hitting rock. My heart hammered in my chest. I pulled the probe out. The tip was coated in a dark, almost black soil, cool to the touch and heavy with moisture. It smelled rich, alive, completely different from the dry, dusty stuff just 50 yards away. I moved 10 paces to the west and tried again. Same thing. Deep, moist soil. 10 paces to the east. The same. I started working my way out from that spot, probing every few feet. I began to map the edges of it. It was a pocket, an anomaly, a section of deep soil about 50 feet long and 20 feet wide, running parallel to the base of the ridge. Outside of that pocket, the probe hit shale at less than a foot. Inside it, there was this deep, dark, living earth. I sat down on the ground, the soil probe lying in the grass beside me. The Yaks watched me with their calm, dark eyes. They knew. They had known all along. They hadn't needed a 50-year-old notebook or a steel probe. They had read the ground with their hooves and their noses. They had found the place where the green held on, the place where the land remembered the water. The extension agent's charts were right, for the most part. But charts are averages. They are a summary of the land, not the land itself. They missed the exceptions. And I was sitting on a half-acre exception that changed everything. For the next 2 weeks, I did nothing but map that pocket of soil. I took samples in plastic bags, labeling each one with its location and depth. I used string and wooden stakes to lay out a precise grid. By the end of it, I had a clear picture of what was down there. It was a channel of deep soil, a deposit of silt and clay that had washed down from the ridge over centuries, held in a depression in the bedrock. And it was holding water like a sponge. The Yaks had shown me the spot. My grandfather had given me the question. Now I had the beginning of an answer, but I still didn't know how deep it went or where the water was coming from. I had reached the limit of what a simple probe and a pair of eyes could tell me. I needed someone who could read the deeper story, someone who spoke the language of geology. I needed an expert, but not the kind with a clipboard. I needed the quiet kind. I knew a man who had spent 40 years with the Soil Conservation Service before he retired. His name was Miller, and he lived over on the other side of the county. He was in his late 70s now, but people still called him when they had a problem with a pond that wouldn't hold water or a field that wouldn't drain. He had a reputation for being able to read a landscape like most men read the newspaper. He didn't advertise, you just had to know who to ask. I called him. I didn't say much on the phone, just that I had a water question on some high pasture ground and I'd pay him for his time. He said he'd be over on Thursday morning. He arrived right on time, not in a new, clean truck, but in a 20-year-old Ford Ranger with a camper shell over the bed, the fenders speckled with mud from some forgotten season. He was a tall, stooped man with pale blue eyes and hands that looked like they were carved from old wood. He didn't waste time with small talk. He just nodded and said, "Show me what you've got." I took him up to the upper 80 on the four-wheeler. The Yaks were there, clustered in their spot by the ridge. Miller watched them as we approached. "Those are new," he said. "They are," I said. "They seem to like that spot. That's why I called you," I said. I showed him my stakes and my string grid. I showed him the bags of soil samples laid out in order on the tailgate of my truck. I handed him the soil probe. I didn't tell him about my grandfather or the notebook. I just showed him the evidence and waited. He didn't say anything for a long time. He picked up one of the bags of soil from the center of the pocket, opened it, and crumbled the dark earth between his thumb and forefinger. He brought it to his nose and sniffed it. He walked over to the spot and pushed the probe into the ground himself, feeling its weight, reading the resistance. Then he went back to his truck and pulled out a tool I hadn't seen in years. A hand auger. It was a simple device like a giant corkscrew with a long handle. He started turning it, drilling down into the heart of the soil pocket. Every few feet, he'd pull it up, examine the soil caught in the spirals, and lay it out carefully on a piece of canvas he'd spread on the ground. He went down 5 feet, then 10. At 12 feet, the soil he brought up was no longer just damp. It was wet, a heavy, saturated clay. At 15 feet, he hit gravel, and the auger came up dripping clean water. He stopped. He stood up straight, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at the hole, where water was now slowly, steadily seeping in, pooling at the bottom. He looked at the Yaks who were watching us from a distance. He looked at the long, dry expanse of the rest of the pasture. He looked at the granite ridge, baked white in the sun. He was quiet for what felt like a very long time. The only sound was the wind hissing through the thin grass. I thought maybe I'd made a fool of myself, dragged this old man all the way out here for nothing. Finally, he turned to me. His pale eyes were clear and direct. "Perched aquifer," he said. The 2 words hung in the air. "It's a geological pocket," he explained, his voice low and raspy. "You've got a depression in the shale bedrock here. Over thousands of years. It's filled with fine sediment, clay, silt. That clay forms an impermeable layer. The granite ridge behind us catches rainfall, and it seeps down through the fractures in the rock until it hits that clay bowl. Can't go any deeper, so it just sits there. A small, self-contained, high-altitude reservoir. He pointed to the different kinds of weeds growing in the swale, plants I'd never even noticed. Those plants only grow where their roots can find consistent moisture. The animals knew that. He looked back at the hole, at the clean water welling up. It's not a gusher. It won't feed a center-pivot irrigation system. But it's a spring. A substantial one. It'll water a herd of livestock through the worst drought you'll ever see. He finally looked me in the eye. A small, slow smile touched the corners of his mouth. I've surveyed every acre of this county for 40 years. I have never seen a perched aquifer this high up, this reliable, that wasn't marked on a map. This is old water. Forgotten water, he paused. Then asked the question I'd been waiting for. How'd you find it? I decided to tell him the truth. My grandfather made a note about it in 1967. And the Yaks showed me the exact spot. He nodded slowly, a deep, knowing nod. They pay attention, he said, echoing the exact phrase I had used to describe them. Good animals. They listen to the ground. He bent down and scooped up a handful of the wet gravel from the canvas. You've got more than just water here, he said, letting the stones run through his fingers. You've got a gift from your grandfather. He didn't need to say anything else. His quiet, professional confirmation was more powerful than any loud declaration. The clipboard expert had told me the numbers, the averages, the probabilities. He was right about 99% of the pasture. But this man, with his old tools and his quiet ways, he had read the exception. He had validated the hunch. The water was there. It had always been there, waiting. The next morning, I was out before 5. The vindication Miller had given me had settled into a calm, quiet resolve. I knew what I had to do next. I rented a small backhoe, a compact one that could handle the track up to the high pasture without tearing it to pieces. The rental man, another well-meaning expert, tried to talk me into a bigger machine. For digging a pond, you'll want more power, he'd said. I told him I wasn't digging a pond. I'm just uncovering something, I said. He gave me the same look my neighbor had, the look reserved for men making quiet, inexplicable mistakes. The sound of the diesel engine was loud in the morning stillness as I drove it up the slope. The Yaks watched from a safe distance, their curiosity piqued by the yellow machine. I positioned the backhoe at the edge of the spot Miller had augured. I took a deep breath. This was the moment my grandfather had deferred. The one marked in his notebook with the words "never dug." I was about to dig. I lowered the bucket and took the first scoop. Dark, rich topsoil, just as I expected. I set it aside carefully. The second scoop went deeper into the heavy, damp clay. The third scoop bit down, and I felt a jarring thud through the controls, a hard clink of steel on stone. It wasn't the scraping sound of bedrock. It was a solid, clean impact. My heart was pounding. I raised the bucket. There, in the bottom of the shallow hole, was the edge of a large, flat stone. It was unmistakably shaped, hand-cut, not a natural rock. I shut down the machine and jumped down into the hole. The air was cool and smelled of deep earth. I got down on my knees and started clearing the clay away with my hands. The flat stone was a capstone, about 2 feet square. Beside it was another, fitted tightly against it. I worked for an hour, digging carefully with a shovel and my bare hands, the silence of the pasture broken only by my own breathing and the scrape of steel. I uncovered a structure. It was a box, about 4 feet wide and 6 feet long, built from flat fieldstones, dry stacked with incredible precision. The walls went down at least 4 feet, maybe more. It was a spring box, an old one, the kind settlers would build to protect a clean water source from mud and livestock. It had been silted in, completely buried and forgotten for who knows how long. Maybe 100 years. Maybe more. My grandfather had sensed it, felt the stones below with a probe or a steel rod, but he had never uncovered it. The final step was to pry up one of the capstones. I used a long pry bar, working it into the seam. With a great effort, it shifted, then tilted up. I slid it aside, and there it was. Water. Not muddy seepage, but a pool of water so clear I could see the clean gravel at the bottom. It was about 3 feet deep inside the box. As I watched, I could see it refilling from the bottom, tiny streams of bubbles rising from the gravel bed where the spring pushed its way to the surface. It was cold, clean, and constant. I dipped my hand in. The water was icy, a shock in the warm morning air. I had found it, or rather, we had found it. My grandfather with his question, the Yaks with their instinct, and me with my patience. By the end of the week, I had plumbed a line from the spring box to a new stock tank, a big one, set in the shade of the ridge. The overflow was directed to the shallow swale, and within days, it had created a small, boggy wetland where green things began to thrive. The upper 80 was no longer marginal ground. It was the most reliable pasture on the entire farm. A few weeks later, my neighbor drove by again in his clean truck. He stopped at the fence line, just as he had before. He didn't get out. He just watched the Yaks drinking from the new tank, the overflow pipe trickling a steady stream onto the ground. He could see the lush green patch spreading out from the swale. He looked at it all for a long time, his face unreadable. Then he turned to me. "Found your water," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. "I did," I said. He nodded. "Yaks are looking good," he said. Then he put the truck in gear and drove away. There was no big apology, no dramatic admission that he'd been wrong. There didn't need to be. In his 2 quiet sentences, he had said everything that needed saying. That was the real victory. Not the water, not the money I'd save, but that small, grudging, honest concession from a good man who believed in different things than I did. That evening, I walked up to the spring and sat on the edge of the stone box. The Yaks were grazing nearby, their dark shapes moving slowly through the tall grass in the twilight. The air was cool and the sky was filled with stars. I thought about my grandfather and the simple, profound wisdom he'd carried. He knew that the land holds its secrets until it finds someone patient enough to listen, and that sometimes the listening is done with hooves instead of ears. He had trusted the old ways, the old instincts, and in the end they were true. That new tractor cab would have been nice. It would have kept me warm for a few winters. But this water, this forgotten spring, this was a gift that would last for generations. It was a lesson in the value of paying attention, of trusting a quiet feeling over the loud certainty of the world. It's a lesson I try to remember. The land doesn't forget, even when we do. If you've got your own piece of high pasture, a piece of ground that people have given up on, I'd like to hear about it. Or if you've got an old notebook with a question mark in it, a piece of wisdom from someone who came before you, let me know in the comments below. Thanks for spending some time with me today.